friend, and they were all concerned. And I said, I knew that this was illegal. He said, oh, no. It's all trumped up. But there is not, you can't find 12 people in Maryland who doesn't think the government is a crook. So he's going to get convicted. And sure enough, he was right, he was convicted. Sent to jail at these fancy jails in Pennsylvania, first-time offenders. So, of course, the litigation went to appeal courts. He served a 6-month sentence. They're very nice to their political transgressors in Maryland. And, of course, the appeals court threw it out, saying that it was really phony. But he was no longer governor, and they had taken away his law license because, of course, he'd done these transgressions. So he became a lobbyist and died a very wealthy man. That's the sort of poetic justice. So let me conclude by looking at some of the observations that are self-evident from this little sketchy biography that I've described. In the first place, all three, Du Bois, Maceo, and Garvey, came from 3 different backgrounds in 3 different countries, United States, Cuba, and Jamaica, but were not dissimilar in the general profiles of their careers. 2 of them, Du Bois and Garvey, died in self-imposed exile in foreign countries. Du Bois in Ghana, Garvey in London, England. As we said, Maceo died in the war prematurely. All 3 of them had weak fathers and strong mothers. But the implication of this I really don't know. I'm not a psychologist, and we have to depend on the Mind-Brain Institute people to say what can we derive from this. Maybe nothing much, but it's a coincidence that is noticeable here in these 3 cases. All 3 countries from which they came were indelibly affected by the experience of slavery and its consequences on the political and social cultures of the respective states, especially at the end of the 19th century. We don't have time to go into that, but the United States is going into this long, complicated post-Civil War reconstruction and readjustment in which the North wins the war and the South wins the peace. And it continues today in a really strange way in which American practical political system evolves. Both the United States and Cuba vastly expanded their slave populations during the 19th century, when the system was already in advanced state of disintegration in places like Jamaica, or the British West Indies, or the French West Indies, or Dutch West Indies. Cuba was expanding its sugar production, and for that it needed labor, and the best, cheapest, most available labor of slaves, later contracted immigrants from India and China. The United States was expanding its cotton production, and the zone went from the south so that in as late as 1807, cotton exports constitute only about 10% of the value of U.S. exports. By 1840, it's over 40% of the value of U.S. exports, and cotton is king. In fact, it is the driving force between behind the textile industry in Great Britain, and explains some of the ambivalence that Great Britain has towards the American Civil War. On the one hand, they're proclaiming that they like people to be free, but on the other hand, they really want Southern cotton to continue to do textile production. And there are substantial parts of the British Parliament were in favor of the South, supporting the South in the Civil War. Making important generalizations about these 3 societies is extremely difficult, because on the one hand, are we just taking 3 exceptional individuals and making them more important in the context of their place in time, or in fact, are we looking at the tip of an iceberg? There are lots of others that we don't know about who are having these profiles, although not as dramatically as these 3 did at the time. And of course, only a little more work will tell us. I can think of a number of cases in the United States at this very same time, up to the 1930s, for example, the first female millionaire who does it in cosmetics and was illiterate and built this big empire in 10 years, which is amazing. Maceo was the only one of the 3 individuals born from roughly in a slave society, since, as I mentioned before, slavery ended in Cuba only in 1886. But legal slavery ended with the Civil War in the United States in 1865 and in Jamaica in 1838. The post-slavery histories were very different in general, but not much different in these three places for people of African descent. And I think that's the important operative point or observation here. Nowhere in the Americas were slaves compensated for their labor and suffering and exploitation when slavery was abolished. No society did that. Instead, they tended to compensate the owners of slaves who declared that they were losing property as slaves. And it's very much like the subsidy that we give to rich American corporations. But then if the Supreme Court calls them individuals, why shouldn't they be subsidized as individuals? America believes in socialism for the rich, and particularly the very rich. Nowhere were slaves compensated, as I pointed out, or accepted into the mainstream of society. Although in some parts of Latin America, for example in Mexico, in Venezuela, in Colombia, in parts of Peru, in Argentina, and Chile, it was not a handicap to be a black person. Simply because the wars gave opportunities for people, and if you survive, you got it. If you go to Santiago, Chile, and you go to La Moneda, which is the presidential palace, one of the things you should notice, or take the time to notice, is that in all those big pictures on the walls about the Chilean War of Independence, all the armed forces are black, the Army and the Navy. Pointed out to Chileans, and they, yeah, that's right, they're black. And it's not so. In Europe, you can say the black Madonnas because they're burning candles, and so the original white becomes black. But here, they're not burning candles. In fact, that was the armed forces. The free people of urban areas constituted these armed forces. In 1812, Buenos Aires had 1/3 of its population black. So there's a big transformation going on here. The fourth observation I would make is that slavery cannot be a singular explanatory factor for the differentiated experiences of the United States, Cuba, and Jamaica. Maceo was a highly respected and much admired national hero in his own country. Du Bois, despite his formidable intellect and outstanding literary production, was more successful and respected outside the United States than in his own country. And Garvey, though internationally known and successful, had far more success outside of Jamaica than in Jamaica. In fact, he was not even politically successful in Jamaica. But he's important in Jamaica because if you look at the origin of Jamaican political parties, both the major parties and some minor parties which have failed depended in their early days on Marcus Garvey organizers and were only successful, and they admitted, some of the early organizers, that without the Garveyites, they would not have been able to mobilize and organize people. These were the only experienced organizers around in Jamaica in the 30s and early 40s. Fifth, that the careers of the three men illustrate the inordinate importance of time, place, and circumstances in the development of political cultures. And that these cultures do not run sort of linear paths. They zigzag, they're really difficult. And it's often hard to make the sort of parallel comparisons, chronological comparisons being. What is more effective are the stadial things, that you say this is a developed society and therefore it has these characteristics, it's modernized, it's industrialized and so on, or this isn't still an agricultural society and therefore you expect different things at that time. Garvey arrived in the United States, important and interestingly enough, before the first restrictive immigration law of 1924. His activities, however, made him a marked man, and he was prosecuted, as I mentioned before, on those flimsy charges, and eventually arrested, tried, convicted, sent to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, and deported to Jamaica, where he continued as before, but with less success than he was accustomed to. So, we're left to ponder, which of these three societies was most conducive to the development of black people in the days of the three characters I have discussed, Maceo, Garvey, and Du Bois. And if we can explain the lack of opportunities and restrictive conditions of Cuba and Jamaica, what made the USA so manifestly intolerant to Africans and Asians, given that it was an expanding society at the time, accepting millions of new immigrants, and with a lot of geographical space into which it was moving? How can we understand those important variable factors of race, color, class, and opportunities, and to what extent are those factors enemies then, as well as today, of an open and democratic society? I must confess, I do not have the answers to these questions, but I do hope that this young audience will begin to ponder some and perhaps, in the near future, provide some answers for us. Thank you very much.